Welcome back to another week of Political Breakfast on WABE. So glad to have you here. We always appreciate our listeners tuning in. Democratic strategist Tharon Johnson here, Republican strategist Brian Robinson also here after a busy weekend of all kinds of things. Protest in Atlanta, basketball watching here in Atlanta, and, of course, Sine Die on Friday evening. So it's been busy around here, hasn't it?
And it's Masters Week, one of the happiest weeks of the year. A 13th week, a 13th month of revenue for Augusta, Richmond County. Great for the state. So, yeah, and despite the rain that we've had, isn't this the most beautiful time of year in Georgia with the bushes and the trees blooming? I just love the pollen sucks, but it is a small price to pay for how beautiful everything is in this state right now.
Yeah, you really appreciate it when spring finally arrives. Yeah, and it feels like it's here.
Yeah, one of the things that's unique about Georgia is that everyone always says, like, when does your legislative session sort of start and end? Places like Texas, who go a long time, right? B-Rob, I think they go a whole year, then they set a year off, and then Florida has a unique schedule. But the one thing about Georgia legislators, and I appreciate the lieutenant governor, the governor, the speaker, they're going to always get us out of that session before the Masters week.
Yeah, that's right.
Unlike Brian, Lisa, I'll be at Masters just hoping and praying that someone actually texts me for the ticket. Whereas B-Rob is going to be down there probably with all these big associations and chambers of commerces. And they're going to be doing the red carpet. So I'm just putting it out there for, if anybody knows, I will be there Tuesday night to Friday. But no, it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful time for the state of Georgia. And then, Lisa, just shout out to the Hawks. I was able to go to the game this weekend, and they lost against the New York Knicks, who were better than I thought, but they beat Utah, so they're in the playoffs. They're trying to fight for home field, sort of home court advantage now going forward. But I'm gonna say this: I think this team is sneaky good. We know we need a little bit help with some folks getting healthy. But shout out to the Hawks, and then the Braves finally won a game. Yeah. So was happy to see that they're actually going to get it together. And I'll just remind our listeners, we know this, the World Series year.
What are you saying? We need a team to cheer for? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they're good. Yeah, no, the World Series year, we didn't start off that good, and then they got on a roll. And I think United is doing well too. And to your point about the protesters, thousands and tens of thousands of people converged on Atlanta to show their frustration. And just really concerns about where our country is headed. And then lastly, 404 Day. This was the first time we had a 404 Day parade in Atlanta.
404 Day.
It fell on a Friday. Folks were at the Capitol. So shout out to all the 404 Day participants. The mayor did a great job of inviting people into City Hall. I was a proud sponsor of the 404 Day at the Capitol. It wasn't disruptive. It was organized. They complied with all the rules, all the state patrol people, men and women who were there. Everybody was fine. You did probably smell a little weed smoke as certain, entertainers kind of came in.
You smell that everywhere in Atlanta.
It wasn't just black people, Lisa. It was some white, Asian, and black
people everywhere now.
Smelling a little weed. Yeah. So definitely people were high on 404, and I'm sure they'll be high on 420 as well.
Yeah, that protest preserved democracy for our children. Thousands, the traffic jam all over downtown because of the turnout there, protesting the Trump administration there. And then word over the weekend that DeKalb County, the CEO, is freezing spending as a result of what's going on in Washington. So, the effects go on, here in Georgia, the stories that we are telling as a result of all of this.
And real quick on the DeKalb situation, and Brian, as a resident, I know you'll be happy to hear this. The CEO did come out and say that they're not going to have any new spending. No one is getting fired. This is a proactive move that she's utilizing to sort of say, hey, look, we are allocated to receive a lot of federal funding. We're not sure if that federal funding will come our way. So to be out of an abundance of caution is to maybe pull back on some new spending. And then also this is something that other CEOs have done, but also under Thurman's leadership, and this CEO is acknowledging this, is that they also eliminated deficit spending. So I think counties are going to look at what this CEO is doing in the cab and sort of hunker down and make sure that they are able to anticipate any cuts. And then also this economy. I mean, we saw that, what is a 1,600 point dip in the stock market in the futures. And so I just think that it affects everyone. But shout out to her for being proactive.
Yeah,
I'd like to see some spending cuts done. I'm glad they're freezing. I do think it's smart. I think it's good governance. We are in a time of disruption and at a time of unpredictability. So, hold the line a little bit here. But hey, let's hold the line even once we get back on our feet and we have more predictability and stability. Let's find some places to cut in DeKalb County, and let's use some of that money to help all of the residents, poor, middle class, rich people, everybody who are going to be paying 10% more per year for the next 10 years in their water bills. That is a significant bite, and we need to figure out a way to provide some relief to the people who live in DeKalb. And I think we need to cut elsewhere. I don't know what the rules are. If water's got to be separate, I don't know, but I do know that it's going to be painful for people in DeKalb. It's going to hurt growth in DeKalb. It's going to hurt people wanting to be, good people wanting to be homeowners there.
Yeah, non-essential spending and the creation of new jobs is a safeguard that the county is putting in place. So I think this is something that was needed.
Yeah, people trying to get ahead. Yeah, the county receives nearly $350 million from the federal government. And as you pointed out, no current jobs are being eliminated, but new positions need the CEO's written approval there. So were you all down at the Capitol Friday night?
I was. Yeah.
And what was the atmosphere like? What was going on? Because a lot of bills did not make it. Did not see Saturday morning.
Yeah, what was sort of strange, and then the rumblings in the hall started around about 8 p.m. is that if you look at the flow, and Brian knows this because he was in the governor's office and he's sat at a vantage point different from mine, being in the day of Sine Die, making sure that all the priorities get done.
Yep.
But the rumbling started in the hall about 8 o'clock, Lisa, 8 p.m. And they were like, hey, man, we think the Senate may actually get done early.
Yeah. Get done
Go
being
home
in
and watch
quotation
TV.
marks.
Yeah.
Right.
And so we were like, but wait, there's all this stuff in the House. And so right when the debate started over, and make sure I get this right, B-Rob, I think it was Alan Powell's school camera bill, which had a lot of debate. And they were just going back and forth. And the next thing I know is that somebody was like, yeah, the Senate is about to Sine Die. And then you just look over there, and they're like papers going up. And so I immediately go back to the House gallery, and the debate is still going on. And the speaker, shout out to Speaker Burns, he says, well, guys, and it was interesting how he turned this, Brian. And I know you saw this, and you probably wrote the remarks, but I'm sure this was part of your strategy. They were still debating the bill, but the Senate had adjourned. But then the speaker did something that was very unique. And he said, look, the people sent us here under this chamber to do the people's business. And we're going to stay here until we legally can to finish out all these bills. And so they did go, about another hour. Yeah. But for those of us that have been in that Capitol, Lisa, till sometimes 1 o'clock in the morning.
Fairly early evening, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it was interesting, and I know Brian can talk about this a little bit more than me. There were probably a lot of important bills that either died, and some that they probably strategically didn't want to have to vote on and come up. But then there were some that I think that people are already starting to position now for next year's session. And as we remind our listeners all the time, this is a 2-year cycle in the session. But hey, look, I was happy to get out of there. I started drinking a little early, Lisa. And
already high from the marijuana fumes from the 404 day, right?
Well, we did have some
Maybe
marijuana.
That's why the Senate left early. Maybe they were just too bloody tired by 9 p.m., right? Just hit it a little hard on the 404 day.
Not naming any names, right?
Well, you know what, B-Rob, our THC, drink bill didn't pass, right?
Good.
But you and I, we definitely agree that we need more people drinking healthy drinks with THC. Of course, a legal limit, CBD in Georgia. Yeah.
My thing on the THC, there was a bill there to ban THC drinks, and my thing is, one, they're set the THC at a certain level, and we can have a debate about what the proper level is, but it's hard to do that state by state because these products are sold in multi-state regions. But consumers should have choice. we know, as Tharon mentioned earlier, people actively, openly smoke marijuana in parts of Atlanta. You can smell it everywhere you go. Smoking is the worst way to consume it. Smoking kills you. THC does not give you cancer. It does not kill you. It doesn't really create a huge healthcare problem unless
you're
you abuse
teaching
it
us how to
terribly.
do it. You're teaching us how to do it. Okay.
Smoking kills you, so let's not encourage people to smoke. Let's give them a safer alternative. Same with like Zen, right? If you want nicotine, don't smoke. Use some Zen, right? Not going to kill you. It will addict you, but it's not going to kill you. I will say on the Senate closing earlier, I think Tharon's recitation of what the speaker said, no, I did not write it, but I was in communication with the office as all this was going on, the speaker was ticked. And I think that came across.
I didn't want to say that. Yeah, I was trying to say a nice.
Well, and I'm not sitting here like spilling any inside secrets. If you watch the video, I mean, he was not enjoying 404 Day, and that was very clear. He was mad that House priorities were sitting over there. Some aren't going to necessarily titillate the public, but there was one that was a bill that would crack down on financial crimes committed by gangs, like illegal use of debit cards and that kind of stuff. So there is a message that you could drive against it. But I do think that right now the relationship between the House and Senate is in dire straits. There was a lot of anger on the House side when the Senate adjourned early. And I'm sure that there's some frustration on the Senate side that some of their priorities didn't get across the finish line in the House. But at the end of the day, that's inside baseball. It is my view from a 500-foot level that the big ticket items in the session got done. Tort reform, budget that provided Hurricane Helene relief, that provided a tax rate cut, that provided tax rebates. These were the big ticket of the big ticket financial items. And then on the social side, you had school safety get passed. That's going to require school districts to communicate about problem students who transfer from one school to another, make sure that more systems have emergency response that gets police there quickly. Some very positive things there. And then, of course, one of the things that's going to get talked about a lot is the girls' sports and the other transgender issues that came to the forefront here. Girls' sports only for girls. This is something Georgians overwhelmingly support. And then they banned taxpayer-funded transition surgeries for prisoners, which I don't know how that's controversial. This is something Georgians overwhelmingly support. And I'll say that the biggest blunder by Democrats in the General Assembly this year was walking out on that vote. They would have been better off to just all vote yes, take the issue away. Instead, they created a wedge issue and one where they are on the losing end. If they're going to do the walkout as a strategy, they messed up in picking the topic. There are issues where more Georgians support the Democrat point of view than the Republican one. This isn't one of those. So I think it was a huge mistake. It will be one of the things we look back on in the 2025 session as something that was a disastrous decision for them politically.
Yeah, Lisa. Now I have to respond to that. And,
of course, you do.
Well, yeah, I do because he. This has been B. Rob only gets excited about a few things every session, but this is definitely one that he has used every single outlet that he is able to breathe or click on to talk about this. But before I respond to the walkout, which I do think I have better context on now, Lisa, after talking to a few folks, I do want to talk about some of the wins that the Democrats had. Yes, tort reform passed, and this was the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker, business community, many associations, big corporate insurance businesses. This was their number one priority. And they were able to keep their caucus together, all but 3 votes. And this is a very, very important point that had it been one different vote, Democrats would have served Governor Kemp, a major, major loss, right? And so it went from sort of being a slam dunk at the beginning of the session, efforts led by Democrats in the special committee, Tanya Miller, Stacey Evans, Sam Park, Al Williams, with some of the major Democrats who actually pushed back. And so while it did pass, this was something that Democrats felt like they were able to keep the caucus together. But the other thing that they did successfully, and I've told some of them they need to get this out here, they also stopped the bill that would have criminalized librarians. They stopped that. There was also an open records bill that passed, right, that was severely amended, something that the chamber and others were very supportive of, but it was actually amended in a way that I think that Democrats should take credit for that. Also, we stopped the DEI, the anti-DEI bill, Lisa. This was terrible language that would have negatively impacted high school students and college students. And Democrats' efforts in the Senate and the House stopped this bill. Unfortunately, RFRA did pass, but I do think that they've now raised enough awareness and issues about this where folks can actually, say, hey, okay, well, let's really pay close attention to this to make sure that the governor who said that this will not be used to discriminate against people, even though we already have federal laws in place in the Constitution, this will be something that they will watch very closely. But let's get to the walkout. And the one thing I think our listeners need to understand is that the walkout was strategically put in place because there were so many other important issues that were not voted on, no committees, no real hearings, one being Medicaid expansion. Lisa, you've been doing politics journalism, reporting for a long time. We've been talking about expanding Medicaid in this state now for a long time. You've heard all the stories about how we literally have poor kids in this state right now who don't have access to food because of the Republicans' inability to act, and how there's literally a gap as far as health care. And these are young kids who don't have access to health care. So there was all these things that talking about the economy. I mean, right now, inflationary actions are being taken in Washington, and they're trickling down to the Georgia. We also talked about keeping rural hospitals open. I mean, all these things were explained by representatives from the House, but particularly House Chairwoman of the Minority Caucus, Tanya Miller. So they made a speech, and they didn't tell anybody. And strategically, why? Because it was pretty abrupt. And camera, B-Rob talks about the speaker's face and the camera. When the speech was done, after she outlined for about maybe say 5 minutes, so all the things that the Republicans were not prioritizing: education, job creation, health care, making sure that people can protect themselves, as far as like more responsible gun ownership. Then they did the walkout. The walkout had two purposes. One, it protected members. It protected some of these House members who the Republicans were going to set this trap for them to force them to have to vote yes or no. Many of them would have probably voted their conscience in their district, but it was a strategic move to make sure that, hey, the membership, we're not going to be trapped by Republicans. And this was a bill, by the way, Lisa, just for our listeners, that and I did my research on this, there's literally no procedures. There's no surgeries that are going on in Georgia. First of all, it's not even legal to do so. And I think that they was pointed out that there's only been 5, maybe in the country, or maybe instead of Georgia, of people who are transgender who has requested something. So this is not an issue that is that important to be debating on and trying to pass. And I think that was the strategy by the Democrats to say, look, enough is enough. We're not going to let the Republicans continue to prioritize Trump, transgender issues, to try to trap us and to throw red meat to their base. So I had to do a little bit more digging, because at first glance, you're like, okay, they're walking out. It was symbolic. It made the news. It made the press. And even though the bill still passed, they used that opportunity to remind Georgians of all the other issues that were being ignored. And I do agree that this is not a top issue that Americans and Georgians care about. This is not going to directly impact people's lives. But it got into this whole thing about how the bill was written. There were certain parts of the bill, Lisa, that said that if someone needed medicine, they probably couldn't get this medicine, right? And believe it or not, when you're in prison, and there's also, last thing I'll say, they also turned it into, and this is what the media is not reporting, they were saying that we have so many other issues in our Georgia corrections facilities to be dealt with, right? Layoffs, wages not being high enough, drugs being smoked, gang activity. Is this the one thing that you really want to talk about when it comes to Georgia correction facilities? And I met the commissioner, by the way, at the Capitol, and I'm going to meet with him soon because he listens to this podcast and he's definitely heard some of the criticism, but he actually informed me of some of the things that they're doing. So that was the reason for the walkout, Brian. And from what I hear from the caucus members, they're fine. They said bring it on, right? Because they're going to explain to their constituents where they stand on these issues. And they agree with you that this is not something that we should even been talking about. It's not something that's occurring. And none of this right now, just want to emphasize this, none of these procedures, surgeries, requests are happening in Georgia. And so to me, it was a necessary bill that was laid to trap Democrats. And Democrats should be commended for speaking up and speaking out to not allow that trap to be laid on them.
It was kind of a Senator Booker move where they used it to shed light on some other issues. You mentioned Medicare expansion, and I don't know. Do you want to respond to that? And when he indicated that Republicans just don't want to touch on that year after year after year. Brian.
Well, we're not going to have Medicaid expansion for as long as Brian Kemp is governor of the state. He's made that very clear. It's not on the table, so they weren't going to waste time on it. Obviously, Burt Jones and Speaker Burns have expressed some openness to it, but it's got to be signed by the governor, and he has said he won't. So they're going to do other things. Tharon mentioned a couple there that I want to touch on. One, the DEI bill, which I'm not an expert on what that was. It had to do with what is taught in schools in Georgia from K through university system. I think that it's a worthy debate to talk about curriculum and what's in it and how we frame things. That is a good thing for our society to do, something we need to do. I don't know, and I didn't get a good answer on what this bill would do in practicality. How would it be implemented? You know, I saw Democrats arguing that you couldn't acknowledge that the Holocaust happened. That seemed absurd to me. I don't believe that. I don't believe the person saying that believed that. But I do think there's a fair question about how would this affect, what curriculum, what certain studies would this change? What is the cost associated with changing it? This is a good debate to have. Let's study it in the off season and come back next year and discuss it. I think that's fair. RFRA did pass. My old boss, of course, vetoed this 10 years ago. Very different atmosphere. Huge corporate fight against it 10 years ago. It would have hurt us economically back then. Corporations were looking out for this. Georgians had projects that were targeted for the state, economic development projects that were on hold as they were waiting to see what deal did on that. That is not the case in 2025. It was passed with a yawn. It was signed with a yawn. No one cares. I think everybody kind of laid their guns down on this a bit because the practical impact, like I mentioned on the DEI issue, isn't that big. And I think one thing that gets lost in this is a lot of the religious rights that get protected by these type of laws are minority religious rights. Those rights practiced by people whose traditions maybe are outside of the American mainstream, may draw suspicion. You know, there's been talk in the past about not allowing people to wear headdresses, women like Muslim women to wear headdresses when they're driving or to cover their face when they're getting their driver's license photo. These are things that we kind of have to work out. It's no longer about gay marriage. That's now in federal law. That's pretty much a settled issue. And 10 years ago, it was still about gay marriage. And on the prison thing, look, this is going to be a mail piece. It's going to be a digital attack on these people who walked out. Walking out was voting no. It is the equivalent of voting no. It is not standing up for the policy of not allowing tax dollars to go toward transition surgeries. Has it been happening in there? No, but we saw the vice president last year talk about how she had gotten it done in California.
Yeah, in 2016.
What?
Yeah, it happened in 2016.
Yeah.
So that was an old clip, but I just think that why would we be spending time? You're actually making the Democrats' point. Why are we spending time on passing legislation where it's not even happening? Like there's so many imminent threats and concerns right now to Georgians that we should have been talking about, and some of which I think you and I both agree on that could have passed. But instead, we're legislating and talking about a piece of legislation of something that's not even happening. So it's all political. It's a trap.
Yeah. It's a trap, and they fell into it. Right? They fell into it.
No,
right?
I don't think. Yeah, I don't think. They
I think it's very powerful.
Yeah.
I think it's a very powerful message. We know people respond to this issue, and that's where the miscalculation was.
Well, here's what I'll tell you. B. Rob likes to talk to a lot of black people. I talked to a lot of white people after the session and during the session, right? The good news for us is that I think that the people that I've talked to about this issue around transgender, Lisa, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, they're not talking about it. What they are talking about is, hey, man, how long is this madness going to last in Washington? like when I was at my events this past weekend, they're like, I know he said it's going to take 2 years when he promised her. Remember, Lisa, you elect Kamala Harris in 3 days, you're going to see the worst recession. I think I posted this on my Instagram. It's since 1929. But if you elect me, you'll have the best economy, best jobs. And the man been in office now almost 90 plus days, and we are on a terrible trajectory towards a recession. And so I think that's what's on people's minds, rather than this trap that the Republicans have set about things that are supposedly happening in our prison systems that are not happening.
That is the message that Democrats should be driving right now, is that. Look at your 401k. That's what they should be talking about. And I'm not even going to play politics with this. Of course, that's what they should be talking about.
Right.
Just like we were supposed to be talking about inflation last year, we can blame it on the White House.
You spent 2 years doing it. You hammered
absolutely.
I was
on message.
And I will say this, Lisa. This is you on message. Now I'm on message. Guess what? Because when you get your butts kicked, Lisa, it humbles you, right? But no, and that's what we're trying to do. And I'm happy, Brian, that you did one thing too. You finally admitted, and you're the first Republican to say this publicly, and I want to thank you for it, is Medicaid expansion is just something that fundamentally the governor is not going to support. And so it becomes a prioritization issue of Republicans, right? Do we really want to push something that we know he's probably more than likely not going to sign? And I think Democrats did the same thing, Lisa. Hey, why are we spending time talking about transgender procedures and surgeries where we should be talking about what I just laid out, right? But the only unfortunate thing, Lisa, is that the walkout, which was symbolic, it was good, it worked. It was just kind of this thing where
it worked for us. It worked for my team.
I think it worked for them too. I think it protected their members, and as Lisa said, it was a Cory Booker moment to utilize an opportunity to highlight all the things that were not being done and how it was just nonsense that they have to even vote on that.
I do want to correct one thing that Tharon said about the prison system, because he mentioned some things that are true. We've got terrible violence in the prison system. In fact, some say we have the most violent prison system in America. And I laugh because it's just so obscene that it got to the point that
here
it
in
has.
Georgia. Yeah.
But we've seen reports where some of these big prisons with 2,000 prisoners or whatever the number is might have 4 guards on duty at any given time. And that is a public safety threat. It's a threat to those guards and their families, but to the people who live in those communities as well. Yeah. We know that gangs are being run out of these prisons. We know that if a prison guard who makes $39,000 a year is told, I'll give you $10,000 to smuggle in a cell phone or to look the other way when a drone drops it in, or I'll go and shoot your children, what are they going to do? They're going to let that cell phone go in there, aren't they? Because all of us would let that cell phone go in there if those were our options. So this year, the Republicans and Democrats, this is bipartisan legislation.
Yeah, I was going to say, get a damn credit.
It was hundreds of millions of dollars. And they're not talking about it because no one wants to go tell their voters about spending their dollars on prisoners, right? It's just not politically something that you want to be talking about and prioritizing in your communications. But they did it, and it was the right thing. These were meaningful changes. We'll be able to hire more people. We'll be able to pay better wages because what we have now is a joke. And it's got to be used to improve security within these prisons, improve health care that is being offered to prisoners. Again, another thing people don't want to talk about. We don't want to talk about spending money on health care for prisoners. And certainly we're all against transgender surgery health care. But if somebody has cancer or the flu, they should be able to get health care. And I'm not sure that we're doing a great job of that right now. Yeah. So we've seen tremendous progress this session. It will be monumental. It will be expensive to carry on, but it's something we must do because it is, we had a healthcare provider in the prisons last year who had didn't get their contract renewed, but they were in a fight with the Department of Corrections because the prisons were so violent that they had lost $40 million because they have to serve whoever presents. You know, if people show up with a knife wound or a broken leg, they've got to service them, even though the cost to them were way beyond what the state was paying them. That gives you a insight into just how broken and highly dangerous, lethal our prisons have been.
Well, let me just make it plain that my grandma would say. This was a made-up crisis, Lisa, on this transgender. And when the director or the people in the corrections facilities, corrections officers, was asked, can you identify how many transgender inmates you have? They only said they could identify 5. And so, you know, I know our listeners sometimes just like for us to just make it plain. And so I agree with Brian. We can talk about hiring. We can talk about wages. There is gang activity. I know this commissioner. I met him. I want to be clear to him. I met him. I've talked to him. He is doing what he can. There's also an issue around transparency. But I just want our listeners to know that all the things that the Republicans could have been focusing on, Democrats were trying to focus on those things. But the one made-up crisis that they laid their hat on, other than tort, was everything transgender, right? I mean, we spent an enormous amount of time talking about transgender sports, transgender surgeries, procedures, and inmates. But out of all the things that they can identify, only 5. And so I just think that Democrats will get the messaging out, and they got to talk about the things that they actually were able to accomplish. Because the Republicans are doing that, but Democrats are doing it as well.
You know, I would say on the transgender issue, this has taken on a life far beyond its impact to our society. But where I would differ in my argument, how I differ in how I perceive it, is Republicans, conservatives, and many in the middle feel like this issue has been thrust upon us by the left. That out of the blue, 10 years ago, we had to all accept this as normal, and we had to pretend that biological males playing in women's sports were really women, and they were the same, and they're not. You can see the pictures are not the same. Even Gavin Newsom very famously has said this is unfair. And so we were being told we have to just accept all this. And in fact, if you question it, look at how they tried to cancel the most famous author in the world, J.K. Rowling, author of Harry Potter, because she was pointing out the obvious. Of course we're different. Of course this is unfair. They tried to cancel her. And she just kept at it, and eventually culture caught up with her. There people were willing to stand up and go, enough. And so that's what you're seeing here, is people standing up and saying, enough. Y'all have, the left has tried to tell us what we can and can't say. They tried to say, if you address this, you are a bigot, you are offensive, you have to be canceled. And this is society going, you're not going to cancel us. Y'all have gone nuts.
This is the Republicans talking about it. Ain't no Democrats talking about transgender issues right now, B-Rob.
Because of the blowback. Because finally people are like, enough.
But the biggest mistake that Kamala Harris made in her campaign was not answering that question.
Totally.
I do agree with you that. But what I want to quote, and we just had her on, right? Elena Parent, Sonia Halpern, all these folks who did vote yes. They voted yes because it was just not something that they were going to allow the Republicans to trap on. And I just want our listeners to know, this is why elections are so important. I'm going to try to close this out, Lisa. I want us to remember, we always talk about how every time there's a party in power, they do the gerrymandering, they write districts and all that stuff, and then the person that it hurts the most, they hem and haw and cram about it. When we take it over, all right, mark this down. I know Lily's not here today, or maybe she is, right? Mark this. When we get it back, and when Democrats do exactly what the Republicans are doing, but I'm not saying it's right, I think it's wrong, then this is how politics are played. And so I think, again, going back to what happened, the walkout was not necessary. There was no way they were going to defeat the bill. We just don't have the numbers, right? The Republicans can pretty much pass anything they want to pass.
And bring to the floor whatever they want to bring to the floor.
And bring to the floor whatever they want to bring. And so the fact that we're still talking about it, though, B-Rob, after the session, means that the Democrats and the Republicans have got to figure out how they both do it. But I just think that this was something that, honestly, I just want to push back on one thing. This is not at top of the Democratic agenda going forward. This is not a major priority for us. It's about jobs. It's about health care. It's about education. It's about safety. And that's our message. Now, Republicans have spent millions and millions of dollars talking about transgender. We're not talking about it. The only reason we even talking about it in this podcast is because the Republicans continue to want to have a misinformed, message to people, and this is a manufactured crisis that they want to promote because it only helps them divide us. We're trying to bring people together over the Democratic Party.
All right, Brian, you got to take us out of here.
It is a
What's
crisis.
your rebuttal? What's your rebuttal?
It was not the right 10 years ago saying, let's talk about transgender issues, right? I mean, Tharon mentioned 10 years ago was when Kamala Harris said that stuff about the prisoners. And then the stuff with the sports came along. And Americans just aren't there. And the left was telling us we had to accept it. And so you're seeing the blowback. And, of course, Tharon's right. They're not talking about – they know that they have stepped in dog poop, and they're trying to scrape it off their shoes. But they tracked that dog poop out of the House floor down the steps last week in their walkout. And
we sprayed it off with a water hose. We have water hoses. We have water hoses right outside the Capitol. We sprayed it off our shoes. We were like, we're not touching this stuff no more.
But if they want to talk about the stuff, like Jason Estevez said, we need to talk about jobs. We all those things that Tharon was talking about, public safety, all of that. And I think the way you do it is just vote yes and move on. And they didn't. They decided to create the chasm there, and it amplified it. It got it more attention, got it national attention, and it got them off message. That's a sort of the political look at this, and they're off message by the walkout.
All right. Well, good political talk here as always. Until the next legislative session, we'll see what's up next next season. Later this week, we're going to talk about the governor's race. It keeps getting interesting and even more interesting. So we're going to talk about that later in the week. Until then, though, we will see you later. Thanks, guys, for checking in.
Thank you, Lisa.
Happy Masters Week.